your question is exactly comes down to the issue, and this is what integral transformative practice is meant to help with a little bit. There are at least a couple important ways that not all of you is at the same level all the time. Yeah. All you have to do is go home for Thanksgiving. Turquoise, yellow, green, blue, red. Most people get down to red. I try to go for beige because it's just complete unconsciousness. And if you're having trouble getting down there, start the eggnog early. Just don't. There are at least two ways that these things catch us up and catch us up really bad. One is what we call levels and lines. And that is if we look at these dozen or so intelligences that people have, sometimes you really excel in some and don't do too well in others. That's okay. You don't have to top out all the way across. I mean, if you had all 12 of your intelligences, topping out at turquoise or something, I don't know, I think that's more like a cartoon character than a human being. Most people excel in one or two lines, and that's okay. You can do very well maybe in cognitive and interpersonal. Maybe you're not going to be so well in mathematical or musical or kinesthetic. To be integral doesn't mean that everything, that you're getting the cigar, that you're a decathlon Olympic psychological champion all the way across the board. It means you're integrally informed about where your strengths and where your weaknesses are. And if you have problems in some of these lines, you can specifically address those. Because what we do find is that if you're not doing well in one line and there's a real pathology or a real mess there, it will screw you up almost all the time. You've got to really pay attention to that. And that means that in any of these developmental sequences, you can develop a snarl, a miscarriage, a type of pathology. And you do have to address those. And one of the most common, we'll talk about just as yourself develops, what often happens, we use the 7 chakras as an example of a developmental sequence, seven stages or levels. As an infant, your oral anal stage, so you're the first chakra, material, you're one with the material world. You're all mouth and the world is all food. A lot of people interpret that as being one with God. But it's God in its material mode, let's put it that way. And then you start to develop towards the second chakra, and then that's more the libidinal, emotional, sexual feeling chakra. So you're no longer merely identified with matter. Now you're identified with the feeling aspect, and that's particularly in ages 3 to 5 develops that particularly strongly. And if all goes well there, of course it doesn't, so we're going to come back to that, then you develop to the third chakra, which is the beginning of a power, intentionality, in a good sense, which means you're developing your unique capacity to have desires. Once that tends to develop, it still tends to be, in a sense, egocentric, not necessarily pathologically, it just means it's still kind of self-centered. As you move to the fourth chakra, then you're starting to take the role of other and develop concern and love and care for others and so on. Now, what happens in any of these developmental sequences is if something goes wrong at a particular stage, it can be trauma, it can be fixation, it can be environmental toxins, it can be brain chemical imbalances, is that you don't integrate the aspects of consciousness at that stage that you should integrate. And so it kind of gets split off as a subpersonality, as a dissociated component. Now, if it's just a small aspect of your impulses, then it's just maybe a repressed impulse, maybe a little bit of anger. You can't get angry because your parents will punish you if you talk back or something like that. Or a little sexual impulse or a little... So if it's just that, then you just split it off as a little shadow element. And then that's a minor problem and you hopefully won't cause too much trouble. But the bigger that gets, you almost sort of start getting these subpersonalities. And we all know what that means. We all know what subpersonalities are. You're going fine, there's a little stimulus, and then all of a sudden you're a psychotic nutcase or hysterical or screaming or regressed or something like that. What can happen is if you look at almost any developmental sequence, what you find going through the development is there's all these little subpersonalities, stronger or weaker, that have kind of been split off in the normal course. Usually they don't cause too much trouble. They're just other little voices that you can, the devil in my ear kind of voice. And some of them can really get quite severe. The severest case, when you have multiple personalities, they actually don't know about each other's existence. They become so split off and dissociated. And so what happens is that when you split off a component of consciousness, at whatever stage it's at, it retains the characteristics of that stage. So if you split it off in around the second chakra or third, it can literally be a 7-year-old subpersonality. And transactional analysis talks about this child ego stage. It's actually 7 years old or 8 years old or 9 years old. And you can tell when it comes on. You're reduced to a childish, whining. Hang around a few more minutes. I'll demonstrate, because I can do this really well. And so they're all kind of down there. Therapy, in the broad sense, means what's happened is that, well, let me back up and say that there's a fundamental rule about development. And Robert Keegan from Harvard, who's also a founding member of Integral Institute, probably the world's best known developmental psychologist, summarized it by saying, the subject of one level becomes the object of the subject of the next level. So when you're at the second chakra, you're identified with it. You're aware of matter as an object, but you can't be aware of the level you're identified with because it's you. It's too close to it. You can't see it. But as you develop to the third level, then you disidentify with, you can start to see the second. It's an object in your awareness. You're no longer exclusively identified with it. But now you are identified with level 3. So you can't see that. That's your blind spot. That's what you are. You're embedded in that. But if development continues, you disidentify with that, you raise to the next highest level, and that becomes an object. The reason meditation accelerates development is because you're sitting and watching, you're objectifying stuff that you had identified with. And so as these subjects come up in your awareness, you're looking at them as an object, and you're disidentifying with them. And increasingly they arise then in a space of open emptiness. And when all selves have been disidentified with, when all selves have been died to, then all that's left is radical no self or no mind, which is this vast transparency that you are moment to moment. And then your self is everything that's arising moment to moment. It's not some separate subject in here looking at the world out there. In the meantime, however, there are all these little subjects that got split off. And because they're now split off, you really can't disidentify with them. Because they're dissociated and cut off. It would sound like, well, I've already disidentified with them. No, you haven't. They're dissociated. You never actually integrated them, so you can't let go of them. So there are all these hidden little miniature egos, if you will, that are clamoring for your attention. They still have the same needs they had when they were split off. So you have a subpersonality that had the needs it had when it was 3 years old. If you have a really horrible oral fixation, it could be a 6-month-old. And you're feed me, kind of thing. So all of those are, in a sense, parts of consciousness that therefore can't be really let go of because they're split off. So that's why when you get in circumstances that remind you of these, that they come up, all of a sudden you can be doing fine. You're somewhere up here just doing fine, and you hit the right stimulus, and all of a sudden, pow, out this thing pops, and it takes over. And it often has its own posture, and your face gets red, and your veins pop out, and it's really outrageous. Those are the things that you watch Stewart's performance. I mean, so classically, what happens in the worst case scenario, the therapy that was pioneered on this, by actually having the multiple personalities start talking to each other, that was the start. And you actually had to get them back so they could identify with each other and see that there was some commonality. Then they could be integrated and then let go. So the ultimate point is to sort of objectify everything until there's nothing but the true self or absolute subject. And it can't be made a subject at all. I mean, you can't see that vast sea. It's just a vast emptiness in which all of this is arising moment to moment. That's openness to the transparency that's your fundamental condition, your ever-present Buddha nature, Buddha mind. But as long as there are these little sealed-off pockets, then that's what's very hard to deal with. And meditation is very good at that. But sometimes you actually have to get in and do psychodynamic work because there's a repression barrier. It's hard to get out by just giving it awareness. You have to use certain techniques like dialogue and so on to actually get in and uproot some of these things. But working with those subpersonalities is a very important part of it. Does that help? Yeah. Again, the central technique of meditation, it works really well because you really are, in the best sense, detaching, not in a repressive sense, but non-attachment to that which is arising. And particularly if you have to sit in shikantaza, you can't act on impulses as they come up. So those subjective impulses, you force them to become object. And therefore you transcend them. Therefore you disidentify with them. And therefore they no longer have a hold of that aspect of your awareness that should be free to embrace everything that's arrived. But because some of these psychodynamic ones are so repressed that meditation is sometimes not very good at getting at those. And so the people that tend to succeed in meditation are ones that either their subpersonalities are cooperating, or there's something in it for them, or they're relatively minor, and people then do very well with that. But we lose a lot of people that meditation could really, really, really help, because the psychodynamic noise is so loud they can't practice very well. So that's why at that point we want to try to get a little bit more integral transformative practice.